Hi, folks. Welcome to the Neo4j live stream. My name's Will, and today we are going to pick up from where we left off last time, working with the GRANDstack podcast application. So we've been working on building out the GraphQL API for our podcast application. Last time we implemented parsing podcast XML feeds and loading that data into Neo4j. And before that, we implemented authorization and authentication in the GraphQL API layer. And today, what I want to focus on is getting started in the front end of our application. And to do that, we're going to use a React framework called Next.js. So Next.js you can think of as sort of a batteries included React framework. So Next.js takes React and adds a lot of common things that we need when building a real world React application. So things like a file-based router, whereas we add new pages, we create new routes that map to those. Nest also has an image optimization component, so that instead of serving massive image files, those files are scaled according to the device we're requesting them on. There's an analytics piece built into Next as well. The server-side rendering aspect of Next.js is really interesting. So we can render pages on the server, and then we're serving actual HTML to the browser instead of having to wait for JavaScript to load on the browser, which is kind of what we get out of the box with things like Create React App. And this is good for performance, but also SEO. The data fetching aspects and data fetching considerations, then when we have server rendering, is really interesting. So we'll see how we deal with loading data in server rendered applications with Next.js, including fetching data from our API. What I want to focus on today, though, is getting the GraphQL client-side authentication set up. So we've built out our GraphQL API, and now we're going to start using Next.js. And I want to get Next.js set up so that we can sign in to our application, and then we can start making authenticated GraphQL requests using Next.js. So that's what we will focus on today. So I think we'll skip over things like how do we add styling, how do we work with some of the different server-side rendering and server-side generated and functionalities of Next, and instead focus on making authenticated GraphQL requests from the client. Cool. So let's make sure we have everything running here. So we should have, we have Neo4j running, so our database is running. Let's take a look at our data model in Neo4j really quickly. So, whoops, not DB schema statements. We just want db.schema.visualization. And let's reset the styles so we see our labels here. There we go. So we've got users that subscribe to podcasts. Those podcasts have episodes. A user owns a playlist and then can assign episodes to a playlist. So if we take a look Let's take a look at our users here. Got 2 users. Here's user JennyCat. JennyCat subscribes to a couple of podcasts. Looks like she has 2 playlists, Road Trip and Jogging. And Jogging has 1 episode of the Accidental Tech podcast. Cool. So that's the data we have in the database. I'm going to start our API application. Oh, let me bring the chat up. Make sure I don't miss that. If you have any questions or thoughts or any heckling, feel free to add it to the chat here. Okay, GraphQL API is running on localhost 4001 GraphQL. And I'll make this a little bigger. So we have, I guess, both unauthenticated and authenticated entry points into our API. So for example, we allow anyone to search. So if you want to search for podcasts by a search string, you can do that without being authenticated. However, if you want to, say, get all of the playlists, or if you want to subscribe to a podcast or create a playlist, you need to be authenticated. And to make an authenticated request, we do that first with a mutation, which is the login, either the login, or I think we have another one that we created, which is sign up. So for already existing users, we have a login mutation that takes a username, login as JennyCat, and a password. I think JennyCat's password is feed me. And then this is going to return a token. So what's going on behind the scenes, we've stored the hashed and salted password in the database, right? So we don't store the actual plain text password. Here's the hashed password. And so maybe let's look at our resolvers. Do we just have those in Next.js? We do. So here's sign up. So we hash the password. So this is the sign up. We want login. So this is the login resolver. So when we pass a username and password, we grab that user by username from the database. Then we hash the password provided in the mutation, compare that with what's in the database, and if it matches, then we generate a JSON web token that is valid for 30 days. And then we can use that token. So this is the generated JSON web token. And JSON web token is just like an encoded JSON payload. So we could actually copy this and go to JWT.io, and we can decode this, and we can get the user ID and the username, the date the token was issued, and the date it expires. So that's the information encoded in the token. which we can see right here. We've just added ID and username to that token. Okay, so we log in, we have the token, and now to make an authenticated request, we add a HTTP authorization header. And so the value for that is bearer, and then the value of the token. So now we can make authenticated requests against our API, such as playlists. So we can say, show me all of the playlists owned by this user. And so on the GraphQL server, we're using this token to find that user in the database, and we will find any playlists owned by that user. Cool. Question from the chat, if we're going to use the new alpha Near-Future GraphQL update. Not today. Today I want to focus on just the client side authentication. So we won't actually do anything with the server side GraphQL API today. But yeah, we'll definitely look at that in the future. Okay, so that was just a little refresher of what we've built so far. So what we want to do now is start to build some front-end components in our application. We said we're going to use Next.js, and what we want to do is basically replicate this GraphQL flow that we just went through. So I want to be able to sign in, and then I want to be able to make authenticated GraphQL requests from our React application. So we're going to need to think about, okay, how do we handle that sign-in mutation? How do we then take that token and make sure that then the GraphQL requests we're making from the React application are using that token? Cool. So there's a few different ways to get started using Next.js. By the way, if you haven't seen the Next.js tutorial before, I think this is quite nice, nextjs.org/learn. I'll drop a link to that in the chat. This is a fun one. It sort of walks you through using Next.js and gives us points as we go along. Cool. So one of the great ways to get started, let's see if it's mentioned on this page. No. Is the Create Next app command line tool. So if you've used Create React app, this is kind of similar. Or if you've used Create GRANDstack app, this is a similar idea, basically a command line tool to help us get started with a skeleton template for our application. With Create Next app, you can pass examples that point to either an example from the official Next.js repo, or you can build your own sort of example that points to a GitHub URL. There are actually, if we look at, not this one, we take a look in the Next.js GitHub repo under examples. There are actually a couple of these already. There's one with Apollo Neo4j GraphQL and with Neo4j. So we could just get started with these. I'll drop a link to these in the chat too. So we could get started with one of these that would skeleton out the Neo4j connections and the GraphQL API in Next.js itself. So one thing that's interesting about Next.js is it is a full stack framework, which means that there's a Next.js server, and we can add routes to that server. So we could actually move our GraphQL API into the Next.js application itself, which I think is something we'll do in a future episode, not today. But anyway, if we want to get started quickly with a skeleton showing how to use Neo4j and GraphQL already with Next.js, we could just use one of those examples. I'm going to start us off a bit more from scratch. How can I zoom in? Oh, yeah, sure thing. Is that better? How's the code? Is the code big enough? It might be too big. Shout if that's not any better. Okay, so I'm in the root here. I'm going to run npx create next app, and we'll just call it next app. And I'm not going to use any of those example starters. We're going to sort of build up from scratch here and see what sort of benefits we might get from using one of those starters. Okay, so that created the next app directory for us. And if we do npm run dev, it says it's created a dev server on localhost 3000. Cool, and it looks like we've got a page here. So let's open the code up in next app. So here's what create next app created for us. A package JSON. The only dependencies in here are React, React DOM, and Next. And here we can see the npm scripts. So npm run dev, which is what I did just now, next dev. So that creates the development server, which has a really nice watcher. So as I make changes to the code, we should see that hot reload on the client application, which is really nice. Build, for when we want to build our static assets. Typically we don't do this, except maybe when we're getting ready to deploy our application, depending on how we're deploying it. And then next start, which again is typically not something we do locally. This is going to start the Next.js server and do a production build. Typically this is what we run wherever we're deploying this, if it's on Vercel or Netlify or wherever. Okay, so that's package JSON. It's created this pages directory for us, which has an index.js, app.js. We'll talk about that later. And then in an API directory, we have this hello.js. So we said earlier that Next.js is really a full stack framework. So that means we can add routes as well. So here we've created a route at /hello. Oh no, we didn't, did we? Is that /API/hello? Yeah, there we go, /API/hello. Right, so the file-based router is relative to this pages directory. So index.js, this is the page at the root we were just looking at. And then the API directory /API/hello runs this route, which is just returning a JSON object. So we could move our GraphQL API into this Next.js API at like /API GraphQL. We'll save that for a future episode, perhaps. Okay, so let's take a look at the root here. So we have a head element. Okay, so that's setting like the title of the page. And then we have the content of the page and a footer. Let's go ahead and take most of this out. Let's take all of that out. What did we do there? Main. Oh, we didn't have a closing main. There we go. And GRANDcast FM. So you can see as we change things, we don't have to refresh, and that updates in the application. Okay, cool. So the first thing we want to do is, I guess maybe let's create a new page here to test out the file-based routing. So I'm going to create a new page called podcasts. And in this page, what we want to do is make one of our requests against the GraphQL API to just render maybe a list of podcasts, right? So this is one we can do without being authenticated. So I can make a request for all of the podcasts that I have in the database and maybe just render those in a list. So to do that, we'll just create a simple functional React component called podcasts. Let's, for now, just return a div, and we'll say all of our podcasts are in this list here. And then we need to export this. And now this page should be picked up at /podcasts. Cool. So there's our file-based routing. Question from Renato. Notice you're not using TypeScript. Is there a reason for not using it? No, not really. I think, if you're familiar with TypeScript, you can see the advantages where it comes in. TypeScript support is really easy to add to Next.js, by the way. I think you basically just have to create like a blank tsconfig, and then that gets sort of automatically populated. So no, there's no reason I'm not using TypeScript. I think TypeScript can sometimes kind of get in the way when I'm sort of playing around and exploring new things. So maybe that's a reason. But no, I mean, TypeScript is great if you enjoy the benefits you get from TypeScript. Great. A lot of the same concepts apply here, but I think, for some applications, TypeScript can be, a bit of a burden. Some cases, especially in learning and playing around with new technologies. So, yeah, good question. I guess that's maybe why I'm not using it today. Cool. So now what we want to do is fetch some data to populate this list. And we know we want to fetch that data from our GraphQL API. So we're going to pull in Apollo client. So Apollo client is popular GraphQL client. There are lots of different ways that we can make GraphQL requests from a React application to a GraphQL API. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just an HTTP request and JSON coming back. So we could even use something like fetch if we wanted to. The benefits that we get from Apollo client, though, are framework level integrations with the state system of that framework. So in React, we have React hooks that wrap the Apollo client API that make it nice to integrate with state in React. And then there's also a Apollo client cache that will cache our GraphQL requests so that we're not unnecessarily loading data and making unnecessary requests to the server. So anyway, that's why I like to use Apollo client. In React, the first thing we need to do is install it. So I'm going to stop our server and do an npm install Apollo client. I guess I also needed to install GraphQL. I think that's a peer dependency of Apollo client. Okay, so while that's installing, what we'll need to do is inject the Apollo client instance. So what I skipped over here is how we create an Apollo client instance. So we basically point it at a GraphQL URI and specify what kind of cache we want to use. The standard is this in-memory cache. And then we need to inject that Apollo client instance into the React component hierarchy because we want to make use of the React hooks that are provided in our components. So here we're wrapping the app component, or like the root component, with this Apollo provider. So provider components in React are a way to expose the context API. So the context API in React is kind of a way of passing through values, kind of like props. So when we pass in props to a component, if like a child component needs those props as well, we might just like pass those through again. This is called prop drilling. And the context API is a way of kind of avoiding this concept of prop drilling, where we're passing things passing values in props to our nested components. And instead, we want to just make values available to every component in the React hierarchy. That's the context API, and provider components are a way to do that. So what we want to do is wrap our root level app component with Apollo provider, which will make the Apollo client instance that we create available in every component. The way that we do that in Next.js is with this underscore app.js file, where here the component is kind of the highest level that we have access to. So what we want to do is create an Apollo client instance and then wrap that component, this component, with that Apollo provider. So let's do that. We'll import Apollo provider, Apollo client. What else do we need? We need the in-memory cache. We need the HTTP link. From Apollo client. I think that's all we need. And then let's create a function here. Create Apollo client. And the first thing we need to do is create the link. So an Apollo link, which we don't need by default, I guess. This example doesn't show it. Do we have one on this page? Down here we do. Here we go. So a link you can think of as like the networking layer for Apollo client. So if anytime we want to modify the GraphQL request, and we use a link. So a link sort of kind of like middleware, networking middleware, I guess is a way to think of it. So we can define these functions that get called anytime that a request is made. And what we are going to do, the reason we need a link here is because we are going to specify that authentication header. And so we need to do that using an HTTP link. So new HTTP link. For now, though, let's just, not HTTPS, HTTP localhost 4001 GraphQL. So this is the URI of our GraphQL API. And then we're going to return a new Apollo client instance, passing in the link, and then the cache is going to be a new in-memory cache. And then our component here, we are going to wrap with the Apollo provider, passing in the result of create Apollo client. Okay, so we've created an Apollo client instance and injected that into the React component hierarchy using this Apollo provider. So now if we go into our podcast component, now we should be able to make use of Apollo clients to make a request against our GraphQL API. So if we take a look here at the query fetching in the documentation, the way we do this is with the use query hook. So we use the GQL tag to create a GraphQL document. This just sort of parses the GraphQL query. And then when we call the use query hook, we get back a loading state. So whether or not the query is still loading, if there was an error, and any data that we got back. So let's import use query and the GQL tag from Apollo client. And our podcast query is the GraphQL query we want to run. Podcast and title. All right, so that's the query we made here. Oh, I have the GraphQL VS Code extension installed. That's why it's asking me if I want to execute this query. I think I need to configure this first. I don't think that'll work. Yeah, let's get that configured. So the GraphQL VS Code extension reads from like a GraphQL config file. GraphQL VS Code extension. .GraphQL, that's our schema. GraphQL config file. Configuration examples. GraphQL RC YAML. Yeah, okay. So in the root of our project, so at the top level, I want to create a GraphQL RC .yaml. And here I'm going to specify what the schema. So the schema is in API source schema.graphql. Okay, cool. Source schema.graphql. And so this is so that I can have syntax schema aware highlighting in schema aware hinting and linting in my template tags here within zoom in within VS Code. That's what it needs to read the schema file, so that now it'll say, oh, well, you could also add these other fields. And then the other thing I want, because I want to be able to execute these queries, I want to specify the endpoint to execute it against. This is the JavaScript version, but I think the YAML equivalent I think is fine. So what is that? Extensions, endpoints, and then just like this, I think just want a default endpoint. The URL is going to be HTTP localhost. Is it 4001 GraphQL, I think? Yeah, and let me drop the link to this in the chat too. If you search the VS Code extensions for GraphQL, this is the first one that comes up as well. So this gives you syntax highlighting for GraphQL files, as well as anytime you use the GQL tag, you get this functionality once you've configured it to be able to execute GraphQL queries that you're typing, and should give us schema-aware hinting. Cool. So within VS Code, I'm able to execute that query that I have embedded in this JavaScript file, which is pretty cool. So these are the podcasts that I've parsed so far in the database. And remember, we only add podcasts when a user subscribes. So you can search the podcast API index that we're using for any podcast, but we only add them to the database when you subscribe to them. That's why there's only a few in there. Cool. So we should also be able to do autocomplete, although it looks like that's not working. Did I have the wrong path to my schema file? API source schema.graphql. No, that's right. API source schema.graphql. Can it introspect if I give it the endpoint? Can it go introspect that? Will that work? Title. No suggestions. I don't know. Well, the execute query part worked. That's neat. It's good enough for me. Something to play around with, I guess. Not sure why it's not giving us the autocomplete. But anyway, back to executing our query. So, right, this is the query we want to use. We'll just pull in the title of the podcast we have. That's fine. So then in the component, we're going to say data from use query. And then in our unordered list, LU, that should be LI for list item. Not sure what LU is. Then here, we're going to say, okay, if we have that data object, then for each object in the podcast array, map over that. I like to use V for value in these maps. I don't know if that's helpful or not. But we're going to return a list item for each one. We need to give each one of these a key to help React re-render these. So we'll add a key prop, and then the only field we have is title. Oh, and I'm missing parenthesis? Yeah. Cool. So let's go back to our application. Server is not running. npm run dev. Cool. And now we are pulling in data from our GraphQL API. Great. Okay, so that is part of what we want to do. So a couple things to take note of here, I guess. One is we said earlier that Next.js allows us to do server-side rendering and a few different modes of server-side rendering. It's sort of this hybrid framework. We can do server-side generation. We can also do incremental static rebuilds, which is really interesting. But when we work with data fetching, that means we have to then, if we're doing server-side rendering, we can either make those requests on the server side, either at build or request time, and those requests come from the server, or we can make those requests from the client, which is what we're doing here. So we are making the data fetching requests from the client here. We're not doing server data fetching. One thing it's important to point out. So we'll talk maybe next time about the server side rendering with data fetching and what that looks like. But what I want to tackle next are authenticated GraphQL requests. So we maybe if we think of the root of our application, so I go to this grandcast.fm application, and it's a podcast app, and the whole purpose of it is like subscribing to and saving podcasts. So I think by default, we want users to sign in. So we might have some routes in our application that are unauthenticated, maybe for like playing an episode. It doesn't make sense to require authentication to play an episode. We can link into that. We can also think of like SEO cases, right, where we want to benefit from people finding our site by searching for podcasts, and we don't want to gate those from Google by requiring a sign-in. But for the main experience, yeah, it makes sense to sign in. So in the index.js page here, what I want to do is handle user sign-in, and then when a user is authenticated, I want to show them their episode feed. So we have a GraphQL endpoint. I think we looked at this a second ago. That is, the episode feed. So this is an authenticated entry point. So I need to have already signed in. I need to have that token, attach it as a authorization header to then show the user, well, here, of all the podcasts that you subscribe to, here are the most recent episodes for those podcasts. So that's what I want on this page. So I guess a few things I need to get there is a form to take the username and password. So let's call this, this will be our sign-in component. And we are going to make use of the use state from React. So if we're working with React state, and we're going to create a state variable called username. And we also get back a function for updating that state variable set username, and then the same for password. And these are going to be just for working with our form. So we're going to return a form. So let's create a function up here called on submit. So when we submit the form, this function gets passed that event. We call event.prevent default because we don't want to reload the page, but we do want to authenticate the user somehow using the values. So we want to take the username and password that they've given us. We then want to run that login GraphQL mutation. Okay, so when we submit the form, we want to execute that on submit function. Then we'll need a couple inputs. Just a text input for the username. And then we need the onChange handler for this. So this is a function that's also passed an event. And here's where we're going to call our update state function. This is the username. So we want to set the username state variable to whatever we're typing in that input. And then we also need one for the password. Placeholder is password, and similar onChange is now going to be set password to update the password state variable. And we need a button. Okay, this is, what did we call this? Sign in. So let's render that. Cool. Username, password, button. It's not going to do anything yet because we need to figure out how to run that mutation. And then the other thing we want here is, let's call this the episode feed component. And here we're going to make our GraphQL request. So feed query equals GQL. So the GraphQL query we want to make is episode feed. Let's grab, I don't know what, maybe like the first 50 episodes. And then we can bring in ID, title, audio, that's the audio file. And then we want to know the title of the podcast that it came from. And remember, this is an authenticated request, so we need to make sure that we have the user signed in before we can make this query. Okay, so we'll say use query, feed query, and then return let's say episode feed, and then something similar to our podcast list. Let's just have an unordered list, and in the case where we have data for each episode, let's map over that and return a list item. We use the ID of the episode since we brought that back, and maybe just for now, just the title. Okay, and we can render that component as well. That is, what did we call that? Episode feed. GQL is not defined. Oh yeah, so we need to import GQL and use query from Apollo client. Cool. So our episode feed is blank. We can verify that we're actually making the GraphQL request if we go to the network tab, do a refresh. Here's our GraphQL request. And the response is empty. So no episodes because we're not signed in. So this user, there is no user really to look up subscribed episodes. Okay. So we now need to handle this sign-in mutation. So we could implement that here in this component, and just, the user types in their username and password. We send that to the GraphQL API. We get back a token. But then the question is, then what? So we have the token. If we do that in this index component, we'll have the token, but we need to get that token up here. So higher up in the React component hierarchy, we need it here. in this HTTP link, because this is where we need to specify the headers that we want to add to our GraphQL client requests. So we have a little bit of state to think about here, right? Because we also have, we want to have the ability to make unauthenticated GraphQL requests. So when we're not signed in, there's no header to add, go ahead and send that. But when we are signed in, we need to keep track of, yep, here's the auth token for this user and add it here. So I think what we'll do is let's create a new directory here in our next app. We'll call this lib. And let's create a new file. Let's call this auth.js. And what I'm going to do is create an auth provider. So we'll make use of the React Context API to keep track of our authentication state. And then we will then have some helper authentication functions that will then be available within any of our components. So we'll be able to have like a login function here that we can export from this auth provider that will then allow us to execute that GraphQL mutation to sign in, and then also keep track of the token we should be using for our Apollo client instance. So I'm going to import from React. We're going to be dealing with state. We're going to be dealing with the context API. So we'll need a few imports here. And then we're also going to be importing things from Apollo client. Should we just copy that? Let's just copy this. Since we already wrote that, copy our imports for Apollo client and that function for creating an Apollo client instance. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is create this auth context. So we said earlier that the context API in React allows us to have, I don't know, maybe global data is a good way to think of it, but data that's available, values, functions that are available to every component. So then from here, we want to export an auth provider, which is what we're going to use to hook into the React component hierarchy. We're going to wrap our sort of top-level app component with this auth provider, just like what we did with Apollo provider. And in here, we're going to say that auth equals use provide auth. This is something we haven't defined yet. We'll define this in a moment. And then what we're going to return is our auth context provider. So here we created this context. So we want the provider component on that. And what do we want to make available? Well, we want to make available our auth hook, which we're about to implement. And then children, right? So all our child elements. So that's our auth provider. And then what are we missing? We want to export a hook that we'll call useAuth. So this is what we're going to import in our components to access any of this auth context. This is going to turn the use context call to auth context. So we're going to expose the context we're creating here to all of our applications, or all of our components. Okay, and now we need to implement this use provide auth. This is where most of that logic is going to live. Whoops. Do this as an arrow function. Just do it like this. That's fine. Okay, so now the actual sort of auth logic that we want to implement. Well, we said we want to keep track of some state here. So one thing we want to keep track of is what our auth token is. So we'll create a React state variable to keep track of this called Auth Token. And initially that'll be null. What else? We need to create our Apollo client instance. Let's move this that we copied from our _app.js file. Let's move that in here. So create Apollo client is going to, create an HTTP link pointed at localhost 4001/GraphQL, create a new cache. That looks good. But the other thing we want to do here is in the case where we have an auth token, so if we have an auth token, then we want to add that auth token to our headers. So let's create a function called get auth headers. And we'll say, if we don't have an auth token, return null. Otherwise, return this object authorization, bearer, and then our token. So then when we create our Apollo client instance, we want to say that in the HTTP link, the headers are set by a call to get auth headers. Okay, so now if we have an auth token, we'll add that as a bearer token. If we don't, then we won't add any headers. And the other thing we want to do is now here, previously we were creating Apollo client in _app.js. So we'll delete the Apollo provider. Instead, what we're going to do is import the auth provider from our lib directory, and we're going to wrap our main app component with the auth provider. What that means, we get an error because it can't find Apollo clients. That's fine. But what that means now is that we want to inject Apollo client here as well. So we'll wrap the child components also with Apollo provider. And the client is going to be auth, so that's a call to use provide auth down here. Dot create Apollo client. And we want to make sure that wraps our child elements there. Yep, cool. Cannot read create element of undefined. Why is that? Oh, that's because we need to return from this use provide auth function. We need to return anything that we want to make available. So in that case, definitely the create Apollo client function. I think that's all for now. Okay, cool. So now we're creating our Apollo client instance in this auth provider and injecting it into the React hierarchy there. Let's make sure we didn't break the unauthenticated case. So if we go to /podcast, yep, cool. Now we're making a request to the GraphQL API and getting the list of our podcasts. Cool. So the next thing that we need to implement in our auth provider is some way to handle the login mutation. So we have this form, and the form handler is this onSubmit function here. So what we want to do is take the username and password, and we want to call the login GraphQL mutation to verify that, get our token back, and then update the Auth token here, which is now a state variable in our auth provider. So to do that, I think let's create a function here. Let's call it sign in. It's going to take a username and password. And we're going to use Apollo client to execute this mutation. So I guess we'll create a new Apollo client instance here, since because we don't have access to the one we create up there. That's probably fine. We should probably cache it somewhere, but that's okay. Okay, so we create an Apollo client instance, and then we need to know the mutation that we're going to execute. Let's just build that here. So mutation, let's call this login mutation. We're going to need to use some GraphQL variables. So we'll say that username is a non-nullable string, and password is also a non-nullable string. And then we're going to use the login mutation, passing in username and password from our GraphQL variables. Let me move this to the side so we can see what we're typing. And then our selection set, I think the only thing, all we get back is a token. Let's test this. Query variables, let's define a username, JennyCat, password, feed me. If we run this, do we get a token? Yes, cool. So this, let's copy this. This is the mutation we want to run. Call this login mutation. That's the mutation we want to execute. Now for Apollo client, we can just use the core API here. Apollo client, is there a mutate? Yeah, here we go. Mutate. So mutate takes the options object, which includes the mutation and variables. Yeah, cool. So let's make this an async function. And we'll say the result equals await client.mutate. And the mutation we want to execute is login mutation. And the variables are just going to be the username, password that are passed into this function. Okay. Let's just log the result for now. What we need to do is grab the token out of this result object and then call set auth token up here. Call set auth token to update this auth token because it's a state variable that will update the auth header here. So then we'll start making authenticated GraphQL requests. But let's test this first. So let's add this to our exports here. And now if we go into Index.js, we should now be able to import useAuth from lib.auth.js. And then in our form, let's see, in the sign-in component, I guess, we want to grab the sign-in function that we just created from the useAuth hook that we just imported. And then when we submit the form, we want to pass in the username and password. These are the state variables here that are bound to the value from the form. So let's go back to our application. We'll sign in as JennyCat. Let's open up our console. Let's see. So what should happen is we should log our token. Instead, we get back GQL is not defined. So let's import that here in our auth provider. And let's try this again. JennyCat, feed me. Cool, and we logged something. We logged a data object login token. Cool, so here's our token. So now what we want to do, let's go into our auth provider down here. So here's where we're logging it. So let's finish this out. What we want to do is just call set auth token. I guess actually let's wrap this. Let's say if we have a result and there is and we have data, and there is a login value. So if we actually have the token, only then should we call set auth token. And it's going to be result.data.login.token. Okay. So now let's see what happens. Sign in, JennyCat, feed me. Hey, now we have a list of episodes. Cool. So what happened there? Let's bring back the JavaScript console. Let's do a hard refresh to clean that out and go into the network tab here. So we can see that this first GraphQL request that we made for episode feed. Oops, what did I do? Webpack, that's not what I want. Clear, refresh. Sorry about that. This GraphQL request, the response is an empty episode feed result set because we didn't send a authorization header. Where's our request header? Request header. There's no authorization header here. I'm not signed in. But now, zoom out so we can see all the requests. Now I'm going to sign in. And now we make another GraphQL request. This one, in the request headers, we can see here's our authorization token. And here's the response data that is our episode feed. Cool. So we've now made, we've implemented the ability to sign in, to keep track of that authentication state, and the ability to make authenticated requests against our GraphQL API, which is pretty neat. One thing we could do, though, is let's implement, we did sign in. Let's implement a sign out. So what I want to do is test that I'm able to sign out, log in as another user, and that I see different podcast episodes. So when we call sign out, all we're going to do is call the set auth token state function and to set that as null. And then I guess we need an index. Let's put this in the episode feed. Yeah, let's put this at the end of the episode feed. Is maybe just a like a sign out button, maybe. So when we click the button, let's just call sign out. Sign out. And that sign out function comes from our use auth hook. Okay, so sign out. Sign out is not a function. Because I'm not exporting it here. Sign out. Let's try that again. Sign out. Okay, I've signed out. So note that the way that state changes and then triggers re-renders in React, when I sign out, that changes the auth token state variable, which triggers a re-render. And because we're passing that in our HTTP link to set that header in our GraphQL request. That token in the header then goes away, which means we're making an unauthenticated request. We don't get back any results, but we do trigger a re-render of that data. So there's another user that we have in the database. Let's log in as Johnny Montana. And we should see, yeah, so Johnny Montana subscribes to different podcasts than Jennycat. So we get different episode feed that we've rendered here. But I can sign out. I can sign in as a different user. And now we get that user's podcast feed. Cool. So I think that is what we wanted to cover today. So this was just getting started with Next.js, being able to make requests from the client to render data from our GraphQL API. We implemented our sign-in mutation. We created a auth provider to keep track of our authentication state in our React application, and hooked that up to the way that we're making GraphQL requests with Apollo client so that we can make authenticated requests to our GraphQL API and render that data in our application. Cool. So I think we will call it good for the day there. If you missed the previous episodes, you can find those on the GitHub README for this project, which is currently grandcast.fm. I did actually buy that domain name. Let me drop that in the chat. So currently grandcast.fm will take you to the GitHub repo for this project. So all the code is here, which I will push our Next.js code up to this repo that we did today, but you can find the video recordings from the previous streams. And also, I've been writing these up as blog posts, so you can also find these on my blog. Here's the one that we did most recently, which I'll link in the chat as well. So you can find the code, the recordings, and if you prefer to read through these in blog form, we'll write that up soon. By the way, my personal blog site, this is also a Next.js application. Fun tidbit. Cool. Well, thanks for joining today. I don't know what we'll cover next week. I guess we could either add some styling and maybe a UI component library to our application to make things start to look nice, or we could take a look at some of the data fetching with server-side rendering and server-side generation. That might be something interesting to explore. Let me know on Twitter, which I'll link my Twitter here in the chat as well. Let me know what you think we should work on next. If we should work on styles, if we should work on server-side rendering and data fetching, what would be interesting. Let me know. But anyway, thanks for tuning in today, and hope to see you again next week on the Neo4j live stream. We stream these to either Twitch or YouTube. So Twitch, if you're watching on one or the other, or twitch.tv/Neo4j, which I'll drop a link to that. If you're watching on YouTube, it's the Neo4j YouTube channel. So I do streams almost every Thursday at 2 o'clock Pacific time. So hope you can tune in next week. But thanks a lot for joining today. We'll see you next time. Cheers.